Good morning, good evening, welcome. This is the Thoughtworks Technology Radar Sneak Peek webinar. So hopefully you've tuned into the correct webinar. If not, you can figure that out. So the Thoughtworks Technology Radar Sneak Peek webinar, that's a lot of words. I thought I would break that down and then introduce today's guests. So it's Thoughtworks, that's us. We're a global software consultancy. We are 7,500 people now, and we build software for and with our clients. And with that many people, that many technologists building software, we get quite a broad view of what's going on in the industry. And that broad view is what we use to create something we call the Technology Radar, and we'll go into more detail on what that is in a couple of later slides. But for now, basically, you know, that's our opinionated guide to what's happening in technology right now. This is the sneak peek. So the full radar will be out next week, but you have you very clever people have joined us today to get an early insight into what's happening on the radar. So we're going to go through a few of the things, not all of them, a few of the things that are going to be on the full radar when it comes out next week. And it's a webinar. If I have to explain that to anyone right now, I think you're definitely on the wrong call. So moving on. I'll just do a quick introduction of our guests. So we're going to have Zhamak, Cassie, and me today as your hosts. And you'll notice this is an old picture of me. I actually feel like I have been chasing the beardless Mike Mason around Thoughtworks for at least a year and a half now. I feel like one of those people who has the wrong data in some government database and spends the rest of their life trying to correct the fact that they're not actually dead. They're still alive and kicking. Anyway, so moving on, there's me. Next slide, please. Mike, I'm the global head of technology with Thoughtworks. I work with our CTO, and I've been working on the radar for 10 years now. This is our 10th year, so I've kind of been involved with each iteration of it. If we jump to the next slide, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Zhamak. Zhamak, would you say just a couple of words about yourself here?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Zhamak. What do I do these days? I change my jobs quite often within Thoughtworks. That's the perk of, I guess, working for Thoughtworks. Been in industry for a while. My focus is really incubation of the next generation technologies, data mesh as an example. Hope to do that, more of that from North America.
And Cassie, if you could introduce yourself as well, please.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Cassie. Been around at Thoughtworks for over 10 years, I think close to 11 now. So very excited to be here. This is actually the first time I've been involved with the group putting the Tech Radar together. So very excited to be on this webinar. But like Zhamak, I've moved around in my roles a lot in Thoughtworks. Right now, I'm currently leading up cloud partnerships and cloud strategy for North America.
And in another interesting take on switching roles, I believe we did one of these sneak peek webinars one time before, and Cassie was actually moderating, and I was one of the panelists, and we're doing it a different way around. So I'm moderating, and Cassie and Zhamak are going to be the expert panelists. So if we jump to the next slide, so hopefully you're familiar with the Thoughtworks Tech Radar. But it is something we publish twice a year, and we look at technologies that are being used by our developers for building software for our clients, and that are kind of moving across the industry. And we try to give some advice on that. We do that twice a year. A lot of people find the radar kind of interesting, a useful thing to read to introduce them to some stuff that maybe they didn't come across already, or maybe to get our opinion, you know, the Thoughtworks opinion on what we think of a particular technology. So we have usually about 100 to 120 different blips, we call them, and then we categorize them with this advice from adopt through to hold. So if something's in the adopt ring, we feel pretty strongly that it's standard, it's useful, people know how to use it, and you really should be looking at that particular technology if it's appropriate for your use case. We give a recommendation of trial if we think something is definitely worth pursuing. We will put stuff on trial actually usually only if we've used it in production ourselves. So it's mature enough for Thoughtworks to have gotten that through into production for one of our clients. Assess is our advice to say, hey, look, this thing's new. Maybe take a look at it, build something small, start to learn about that thing. And then hold is kind of our, here be dragons advice, where maybe something's not ready yet, or maybe we're seeing some kind of problem with the use of that particular thing. So today's sneak peek, the structure is going to be, we're going to jump through some blips and then also reveal a couple of the themes from the radar. So with 100 blips on each radar, that's quite a lot of stuff. So we also try to boil down some bigger storylines to help people understand what's happening in the industry. I will say at this point, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function within Zoom to submit your questions. That helps us track the inbound questions and also kind of strike them off if they've been answered either explicitly or during the course of the chat. So please do make use of that Q&A feature. And with that, I think we can move forward into our first blip. And I believe, Cassie, you're going to talk about this one.
Yes. So hi, everyone. I'm actually quite excited to introduce this first blip as we have been living in a remote world for quite some time now. So one of the things that we're driving from this technique and trialing this out is using remote native processes and approaches. So a lot of discussion in the group around the pros and cons of the different types of tooling and collaboration tools like Visual Studio Live Share and GitHub code spaces. So there's some really great collaboration tools in order for developers, engineers, project managers, everyone driving this remote type of workflow and collaboration. So really exciting stuff there. But I think one thing that we wanted to address as well is sort of the fatigue that we're seeing a lot in this remote collaboration. So part of this blip is really talking about how to use the more remote native type of processes and approaches, and not really using and trying to replicate being in person on a remote way. So I think the term Zoom fatigue has been expressed a lot in the past few months, or at least it's come up a lot for me. And actually looking up some statistics, I mean, I was actually looking at some of the things around, there's a 30% increase in scheduled meetings now during this COVID era. And so one could imagine that people can get very, very tired having these meetings over and over again. And so one of the things is to ward against, trying to replicate the in-person traditional way of how we were working together in this remote sense, and really taking a step back and just looking at and talking to your teams, not at your teams, and see what's working and see what's not working, and understanding what processes need to change. I think a great example that we've even experienced, like in a workshop that we were doing, is we had to take much shorter chunks of sessions, just because people get tired over the Zoom, and really look at the different collaboration tools that's way more effective and really driving the focus. So yeah, this is the first flip we're presenting today at the webinar, and I think it's very exciting because, as I mentioned before, my first Tech Radar sessions, we did that remotely, and this was the second time we did that this year. So it's just very exciting stuff here.
I think the increase in scheduling is kind of an interesting one there. I feel quite heavily scheduled right now. I think something that's interesting as well is the kinds of social stuff that usually happen in an office environment or whatever. You kind of have to make time to schedule that. So when we were building the radar, one thing we did was we had a lunch break, which was weird because we had global time zones, but whatever. We had a long break in the middle of the meeting. But what we said was optionally come back 15 minutes early and we'll just hang out and chat. And so that gave us some of that kind of social connection that everybody craves. Cool. Okay. Well, moving on to the next one, Zhamak, I think you were going to talk about this one.
Sure. I'm actually quite excited about this one. So it's a new blip on this radar. It's in asset string, trust over IP stack. So Trust over IP itself is a young organization, a global organization under Linux Foundation, formed this year. And their mission is to simplify and come up with a set of open standards around how we establish trust digitally online, right? How do we establish trust between individuals, between organizations, individuals, organization, and the things, right? With the Internet of Things. If you think about what is the definition of trust? I've looked at a lot of different quotes and different write-ups, and Rachel Batson, who she's a fellow at Oxford, she's been researching this topic quite a while, simply put it as confident relationship with an unknown. When you have ambiguity and uncertainty around another entity that now you're transacting with, somehow you need to establish trust with that entity, with that person, with that organization. And if you look at how we establish trust just over decades, we had the pre-internet era. I mean, that era still exists because we still have offline and face-to-face interactions. So I just went to the pharmacy actually to get Sudafed because I have a lot of coughing, and they don't sell that to you without your ID. For good reasons, but the way we establish trust, like in with prior transactions, I take my ID, I take my license, pharmacy trust that the person who issued that license to me, the DMV here in US, and then we establish a trust with a few pieces of information. The pharmacist doesn't need to know everything about me; they just need to know a few pieces on that license, and I can get my medicine and leave. So it was really around this triangle of trust, very peer-to-peer and a decentralized way, right? Me, pharmacy, will have a trust relationship, and me, my, other organizations that I work with have a different trust relationship. And then it came the internet era, and we started, for some reason, I'm sure the big computers in rooms had something to do with it, with this idea that we establish trust through this user ID and password, right? We will go up to a screen and we enter user ID and password. And today that has a lot of challenges. I read this somewhere, an 18-character password can be broken on AWS with $25 of spent on processing power. We establish trust by providing a set of personally identifiable information. You've gone through these registration pages where you provide your date of birth, maybe your SSN, in US Social Security number. I'm sure there are other IDs that's supposed to be only known by you, and they're protected behind my password. But I doubt that's the case, because with all the breaches that happen, I doubt I'm the only person who knows about those people. So that's subject to impersonation. And if I have to send copy of my paper documents, that has its own challenges. So we ended up in this internet era with this trust gap and a lot of friction, right? We had this idea of that every site will have its own user ID password, and then that we thought that just simply doesn't scale. So we moved from kind of one identity to federated identity with OpenID, protocol, and OpenID Connect, and so on. To make it a little bit better, trust, provide user ID password with one server, and then trust that server to give, kind of approve your identity for others. But all of these kind of systems are based on a few assumptions, assumptions in that paradigm that kind of broken for this scale of operation that now we're talking about online, based on, centralization that is subject to attack. You have a centralized certificate authority or centralized user registry that are really subject to attack. And we are seeing our clients asking us for new solutions that can protect themselves. So trust over IP stack is essentially a 4-layer governance and technology stack that introduces a new way of establishing trust based on a few foundational principles, based on basically self-sovereign identity or decentralized identity, which in fact is a blip on our radar in itself. That you cryptographically, using public key, private key kind of infrastructure, introduce your ID, you create your ID and you control it. It implements that triangle of trust that we were used to in the, offline world, but with kind of distributed ledger technologies, that you have an issuer that can issue credentials to you that then you can share with whoever needs to verify your existence, and there is an inherent trust relationship between the issuer and verifier. They call that verifiable credentials. That also is on our radar, so you can get to know more about it. And really, it uses the distributed ledger technologies. It uses distributed cryptographic technology, so it can move away from PII protected through passwords controlled by centralized, kind of identity providers. They use existing W3C and utilities that exist and being more generous. At the bottom layer, they have the utility layer, verifiable credentials, decentralized identity, public key, cryptography. Second layer is around, okay, now that I have my own identity and I have my credentials, how do I actually communicate that, right, between verifier and kind of holder of that identity? So that's the communication of the decentralized identity, peer-to-peer protocols between digital wallets or digital agents where you keep these certificates. That's the second layer. That's kind of their narrow waist of internet, like their TCP/IP was for internet. And then you have the data exchange protocol implementing this triangle of trust protocol, and finally the application ecosystem. What does this mean in healthcare? What does this mean in finance? And they work with adjacent kind of foundations that provide actual technology, with Hyperledger that provides open source Aries and Indies, a bunch of stacks that you can actually use today to implement some of these. They work with DIF that implements the comms layer and so on. So we're really excited because they're trying to create open standards and, make it possible to implement a new way of establishing trust, a new way of authenticating ourselves on internet.
And Zhamak, we've got a question from Daniel here who says, how is trust over IP positioned against something like Beyond Corp from Google? I know that we had Beyond Corp on our radar once in the past.
Yeah, that's a really actually good question, because when you talk about trust, it manifests itself in so many different contexts, right? So Beyond Corp talks about, I think they're complementary and they're not supposed to kind of completely replace each other, but they're complementary. So what Beyond Corp does is trusting users of services within our organization, like Googlers want to access, Google services and so on, and really implementing techniques based on zero trust architecture that identifies you or trusts you, not based on the perimeter of the organization, not based on the firewall, not based on you are on a VPN within, the network, but based on other factors. So that's complementary to what trust over IP tries to do, to say, in fact, now let's go one step further. And the way now that I've used, a bunch of other parameters to protect my services so that I don't have to protect based on perimeter, and I've implemented this zero trust architecture, how can I identify you? Do I only use your ID password, or are there different way of getting credentials from you? And I know Google uses a bunch of things that applies to their organization, but they're not globally applicable, like where your mobile or device has moved around and where you've connected from and things like that. So trust over IP tries to solve that identification part problem or credentialization part of the problem using a completely different set of techniques that are globally applicable. It's not just an enterprise thing. You can use it in enterprise, but beyond enterprise at a global level. So I see them as complementary.
Great, cool. Thank you, Zhamak. And moving on to the next one, Backstage, Cassie.
Backstage. Now we're going to talk about something that I'm pretty excited about as well. So really, as we all know, the tools and technologies and everything has increased dramatically over the last 10 years, 20 years. And so I think a lot of organizations that we're finding right now, and a lot of our clients, are trying to figure out some form of standardization and some form of lean governance around here. So we really want to look at, tools and developer portals that would be able to provide some sort of consistency. So our engineers and teams can really focus on the product and the business outcomes, as opposed to muddling in all of this tools and technology and complexity and overhead, and taking more time to do that versus actually focusing on like what we're actually trying to build. So we're seeing a lot of organizations trying to support and streamline the development environments and through developer portals like Backstage. So Backstage is an open source developer portal that has been created by Spotify. So this is an in-house tool that they've used, and as I would say, like eat your own dog food. They've been building it for their own purposes, which I find very, very interesting. The thing that strikes me about this particular framework was the architecture is very much a plug-in architecture and framework around this. So it's very exciting because then you can actually take something like Backstage and build your own plugins for your own enterprise, because each organization, each domain is very different in the types of developer portals they're trying to drive to. So I think there will be some traction in Backstage in the future. It's right now it's in assess because we have a few teams and few clients looking into it and seeing if this is something that's right for their organization. But I think what's very cool about this is it's really something that if you think about Spotify and really looking at not only the tool to enable these types of practices, but they've had lots of processes and things like discoverability as a first-class citizen, looking at this certain dashboards and really streamlining some of the infrastructure. So a lot of cool things coming from Backstage, and I know that there's probably gonna be more to come from this. So we want to assess and we want to take a look at it. So yeah, that's Backstage here.
Excellent. And we are seeing questions in the chat, so please keep those coming. I'm going to try to ask questions as we go, but also maybe save a few interesting ones for the end, depending on how much time we have. So if we move on to the next one, that's Zhamak again. Yeah.
All right. So I said this. You need something new, something old, something new, something blue, something along those lines.
Something borrowed, something blue.
Yeah, something borrowed, something blue. I completely messed that up. So Bokeh was one of those something old ones. It was an narrator for quite a while. It was Bokeh and something else, and we moved it to trial. This radar. So what is Bokeh? Bokeh is an open source Python library for kind of scientific data science, plotting, and data visualization. It's actually very much loved and known within the data science community, but the reason we kind of blipped it again was because it may not be as well known within the general kind of developer generalist developer community. It's great for data science use cases because it provides high interactivity performance when you have a large set of data or when you have streaming data and you need to have a responsive kind of way of drawing this. Of course, it's better than static images and the type of plots that desktop application provides. It lets you to drill into the data, so it's great for exploration. You can run it in some sort of a server mode, and if you want, and have kind of JavaScript-based rendering of it as a web application or a web interface or web widgets, which is great for sharing. The reason, I guess, this is actually quite a busy space. There are a lot of different tools, and we have some of them around the visualization, I think, here. But the reason we kind of like Bokeh, or our data scientists like Bokeh, was it actually focuses on visualization, and it doesn't, it is a separation of concerns, right? It doesn't try to do too many things. Like there was another tool mentioned, like ggplot, which does data aggregation and data manipulation as well as visualization. Or there's another framework we have, Dash and On the Radar and Shiny, another one that they try to be the full kind of web development framework as well as the visualization. So it doesn't make a lot of assumptions how you want to use it. It doesn't have a lot of dependencies, like you can do visualization in notebooks or with pandas, but then you end up with a lot of kind of environmental dependencies. So it looks like a small, well-contained library where you deal with large data sets or streaming data sets, and you need to do plotting, and it has different diagrams. It's not, in some cases, it doesn't have, you might be familiar with D3, for example, as a JavaScript data visualization platform. I actually really liked it. I always love to go to just on their website and browse the examples to get inspired how I can visualize some piece of data. But the reason, I guess, this is different, one is that D3 maybe has a little bit more kind of diverse set of diagrams that you need, but it doesn't really cater for kind of the large data sets and the streaming data sets. So that's a comparison if you're familiar with D3.
Cool. And there's a question here from John who says, is there a reason we selected Bokeh over Vega or Vega Lite? I know the blip when it was old was Bokeh/Vega.
Yes.
And I actually can't remember why we dropped the Vega portion of it.
I have to go and ask, but I think it was more that, Bokeh was the one that we had experience with. The radar doesn't try to be complete. We try to put blips that we personally have an experience with. I compared it to a bunch of other things we had experience with. And that's the one that is still relevant. So it's probably kept itself more up to date and still a relevant technology, even though that it was introduced a few years ago. But I can do it.
We can figure that out. Yeah. We actually take a ton of input. So the radar group is about 20 people, and we're representing all of that input from about sort of 7,500 people globally. So sometimes we don't have every little thing at our fingertips, but we can go figure that out. And then the other thing that we do on the radar that I mentioned briefly was we have themes, and those are trying to help people understand, we've got tons of individual blips on the radar, but what's really going on? And so we have a number of themes each radar. The first one that we're going to sneak peek today is visualize all the things. I think, Zhamak, you were going to talk about this one.
Sure. Yeah, this one was an interesting one. I don't know, there was something in the air, like increasing cognitive load that we have to deal with as technologies, with all of this kind of continuously changing and rapidly getting more complex solutions, or it was just a coincidence. But we had a lot of conversations around different kinds of visualization tools. And I do think it does have something to do with, kind of this rapid expansion of proliferation of technologies, as well as the complexity of the systems with decentralized approach. So we had a lot of discussions around visualizations, the ones that I remember, I guess, from top of my head and to share, and the ones that, some made it to the radar and some didn't make it to the radar. We just talked about Bokeh. Dash is another one. So we had a group of, I guess, visualization tools around data science and data visualizations with Dash and Bokeh. Making it to the radar. We had also a lot of discussions around infrastructure and architecture visualization. So C4, and there was a group of them around, kind of cluster around C4 models. So C4 modeling is a kind of 4-layer architectural modeling language that you can express it, in different ways, in code, or get that code, or declaratively, and get that code built as or rendered as diagrams that allows you to hierarchically look at your architecture with some sort of a consistent language, define the context, define the components, define the containers that run those. And then we had a few tools that unfortunately didn't make it to the radar because we can't put everything there. And we had, I don't know, 300 blips kind of trying to make it to the radar. And one of them was C4 Plant, which is a intersection of C4 modeling with Plant UML, which is a UML diagramming kind of DSL. And then one neat thing about that I actually quite liked was that you can introduce those architecture diagrams as code, kind of project level code snippets in Visual Studio Code, and be able to kind of see, check it into code as part of your project, and still be able to render it in kind of Visual Studio and see it. There was another DSL, Structurizer DSL, which was describing an architecture in code and then using tools like Plant UML to visualize it. So so visualize all the things was the theme, we kind of catch-all thing that we ended up with.
Thanks, Zhamak. Yeah, we try to have some fun with our theme naming to try to make things a little less dry, because sometimes staring at technology things all day can get a bit wearing. Okay, and then we've got another set of blips to talk through and one more theme, and then we'll also take questions. Do throw questions in the chat as we go. If you have broader tech industry questions, we've got a couple that people have submitted already, which I will be hitting the panelists with later. And Cassie's looking very scared because she can't see all the questions, I guess. But anyway, I've got questions for you guys later. But back to blips. We're going to talk about secure enclaves, and I think that's Zhamak again, or Cassie,
Okay.
I don't know.
We were hoping to kind of move the blips around so one person doesn't talk the whole time. But
well, let's do the next one then. Let's go to the next slide. Let's go to the next slide, and Cassie can talk about AWS.
Yeah,
okay. Let's do that.
I can talk about that one. Give Zhamak a break. So yeah, one of the blips that we have in Assess, and then we're continuing here, is really AWS Cloud Development Kit. And so this is an open source software development kit to define the cloud infrastructure in code, and also provision it through AWS CloudFormation. So traditionally, at least a lot of the accounts and clients that we interact with, many of our teams actually use Terraform as a default choice for defining the cloud infrastructure. However, lately we've actually been seeing an uptick in a few teams actually experimenting with AWS Cloud Development Kit, and there's some positive feedback coming back from it. So that's actually why we wanted to put it in Assess in this Tech Radar. And so essentially, what this kit does is it allows for the first-class programming languages in order to dynamically create some of the definitions for the infrastructure in like both AWS CloudFormation, et cetera. And so one of the things that we've talked about and talked to Keith Morris and a few folks, some of our infrastructure gurus, is really looking at a tool like this, or Pulumi is another one, that it becomes very useful for writing code that you want to dynamically generate your infrastructure. So being able to have that flexibility, and then using your language of choice, so you're not flipping from going from Python to configuration files and things like that. So it seems that a lot of teams are seeing that this is simplifying some of the things. However, I think one of the things to note is that you still want to pragmatically look at what's suitable for how you are actually driving your infrastructure. So whether you're wanting to have a dynamic or statically defining infrastructure is actually a question that you should definitely ask yourself before just jumping into a lot of these tools. I think one of the other things that we wanted to keep on this radar as well for Assess is because there's a lot of things in beta around the Cloud Development Kit around generating some of the Terraform configurations. So we've seen that HashiCorp and AWS have partnered up in order to see what they can do here, since Terraform is traditionally the choice. So now we're looking into seeing what's on board for this going forward. So keeping an eye on this and watching our teams using it and seeing what we have in store.
So Cassie, is this an Amazon sort of official response to the success of Terraform, or like how do the two coexist?
So the two, I think one of the things, and I could probably speak around this, is been partnering with AWS for quite some time now, is that they are very much in the mode of like customer centricity and actually what works well for the organizations. As what we've seen is Terraform has actually worked very, very well for many years. And so they are not bullish about saying, oh, we need to use CloudFormation. They're actually very much on like what's going to be the right tool and the right choice for the customers. And so this is, yes, probably a way of saying, hey, we understand that Terraform is something that most organizations are using. So how can we play with that?
Cool, thanks, Cassie. So let's jump back a slide. I don't know what happened with my video just then. Jump back a slide and we'll talk about this one.
Right, thank you. So this one, secure enclaves as a technique in SS, is also a new blip, not a move. And you might have heard of this as, referred to as trusted execution environments, TEE. And is essentially a technique for protecting data in memory. We've had, kind of techniques for a long time to protect data in transit with TLS SSL. We had, protect data at rest with various levels of encryption, disk level encryption, hardware level encryption, and above at application level. And this one really, the attention has come now to data in memory protection and security of data in memory for a variety of reasons, right? As you can imagine, we are now putting our data in cloud. So PII information's on cloud. We need a different think about data protection a little bit more seriously and reduce that attack surface, even at the time that, you might be, identifying a user or verifying a signature and you're loading it, or your signature, you're loading a key into the memory to do the verification. And at that point, there might, you have exposure to any attack, to any core dumps that data in memory, the key in memory is now exposed. The techniques around it actually has existed. So any of folks on the call that have been hardware developers or firmware developers are familiar with kind of security chips that at hardware level, a lot of devices, handheld devices and so on, had a separate security chip, separate memory, separate storage, just for very, very secure, limited operations, but very secure operations. So higher, abstraction of security at the hardware level and isolation of application context at the hardware level. Apple, for example, has had that for quite a while with their secure enclaves. And at the OS level, they provide you a bunch of APIs that can perform operations, secure operations. And the way they've designed it is actually quite nice that, it's not that you store the keys in a secure enclave and then bring it to the main application memory and operate with it. In fact, the operation on the key also happens in a separate kind of CPU, separate instruction set. So you would like say encrypt or decrypt or verify signatures. So the operations are at that level. So there is no communication of the data would happen between your secure enclave and the rest of it. But what's interesting is that with the new buzzphrase, confidential computing, which is essentially this, protecting data in memory. And now we're seeing this movement of providing that level of hardware level security on the cloud. So if you look at the Confidential Computing Consortium, which is a foundation under Linux Foundation with a bunch of both hardware providers and cloud providers, they've had a few write-ups on white papers around what does confidential computing mean and why do we need it. They actually articulated a series of attacks that have already happened. I'm not personally familiar with them, but there have been attacks that brought us, made us pay attention to this level of security. So it's a good place to kind of get information. But we will see now the race towards confidential computing. Azure has their computing infrastructure that promises, and these are all in early stages, that promises TE-enabled VMs. And they have also the Open Enclave SDK, which is an open source library to perform kind of this sort of operations with your interface with your secure enclave. We have GCP confidential VMs and compute engine, which is in beta, again, allowing VMs with data encryption in memory. We have AWS Nitro enclaves in preview. Actually, preview haven't even come. Preview will come. That introduces kind of cloud-based now security. And I think if you're in healthcare, if you're in finance, you're dealing with PII, it's something to pay attention to. But we always also like to kind of share the other side of it. Why there is this enthusiasm and the rush to get our cloud security enclaves in place. We would also encourage to kind of look under the hood, because at the end of the day, those VMs, depending on what hardware provider they're using, what CPU they're using, do your homework to know if there are any vulnerabilities, because there have been in the past cases that the hardware provider provides claims kind of security enclave, but it might be a little bit of a security theater, and there might be some vulnerabilities that they would fix, but that might be known at the time. So you may need to, in this particular case, look under the hood a little bit. But certainly something to pay attention to.
Cool. And in terms of slide shuffling, we're gonna shuffle again and go forwards to which one are we going to? Bounded low-code platforms. So I think it's going to be the next one forward. There we go. And Cassie's going to talk about that. Then we'll go back one, and then we'll go to the theme.
Awesome. So yeah, so I wanted to talk about bounded low-code platforms in this one, and we've actually put this in assess. So just as a note, this was a massive topic of conversation because previously we had low-code platforms in hold because of the specific nature of low-code platforms, and so the discussion came back around because really, there's a lot of things that's actually come into the market, things like Amazon Honeycode and Parabola and IFTTT. Like these are the types of tools that actually are creating certain workflows that are like some of the low-code platforms. So one of the things I wanted to note here, because we've had it in hold as low-code platforms, but really wanted to put it in assess because of some of the new tooling and some of the sophistication coming around this, is the word bounded. So we really wanted to look at really understanding, hey, how do you actually not swing the pendulum too far to the left or to the right in terms of using these low-code platforms for everything, and actually introducing a lot of business logic and a lot of the things that we actually need to put in well-formed engineering practices and evolutionary architecture and thought processes around. But maybe even actually looking at processes like this so we can expand, and this is the theme that we're going to talk about in just a little bit, but expand the users and people trying to create some of these workflows to non-programmers. So this has actually been a very interesting topic, because if we're looking at across many different domains, you may not actually have to have a full development team trying to create some of these features when it's actually out of the box. Some of the workflows and things like that actually makes sense to use some of these low-code platforms. So one of the things that I've actually been looking at this one as well is I'm actually going to steal a little bit from Mike's article from a bit ago in terms of some of the types of applications that we would like for people to think about in terms of the boundedness of low-code platforms. So maybe it is a good time to use low-code platforms if the application probably has a very simple UI and is something that you can be taking advantage of building on top of some of the newly developed digital platforms or APIs. So something that's actually quite simple and things that we would say like more of a utility-based type of application. Another criteria is if there's an off-the-shelf version that really isn't available in order to accomplish what you're trying to do from a business processes point of view, or if the off-the-shelf alternative is too complex or too expensive and it's something that's simple that you actually just want to do in order to increase your own productivity in your organization. So I think one of the things that we've also looked at is the low-code development teams themselves, they should be small. They shouldn't have that much interdependencies on all of these massive legacy systems, because essentially what you don't want to do is add to that mess. You don't want to actually be bound, I say bounded, but be, niched into this area where you're going to have to throw that away in the future as, you're trying to evolve your IT landscape and estate. So this is something interesting where, we were kind of shying away from it a lot, and when we put it in hold, but I think, with the word bounded, it's proceed with caution and always look very pragmatically of how you're going to be using tools like this.
Yeah, because I think there is a lot of, and we can talk about this more in a minute, but there's a lot of pressure on productivity in the IT industry right now, and low-code platforms are promising a lot, and we as technologists need to respond to that in some way. Brian is asking, how do low-code platforms differentiate themselves from 4GL languages of the 80s and 90s? I think our colleague Neil Ford would say, well, they don't do a very good job of that at all. It's all the same promises and things that we've seen fail in the past. But I think there's quite a lot of nuance to that. Interestingly enough, tomorrow night we'll be recording a podcast going into some of this stuff in more depth. So it could be in a couple of weeks you'll be able to tune into the podcast and get a few more opinions on the low-code topic. So if we jump back one, we're going to cover one more and then go to our last theme.
Okay, so productionizing notebooks as a technique on hold. And I must confess that we are probably very unpopular. I will be very unpopular with this technique among the data scientists who might be on the call right now. So what is this? Initially, I think this was already on the radar. It was called maybe Jupyter Notebooks on productionizing Jupyter Notebooks on hold, I believe. And we felt strongly to perhaps a bit more generalize it, call it just notebooks or computational notebooks, and repeat it on hold. So why? Let's go back, I guess, a little bit of a walk down the history lane a little bit more. Computational notebooks were first introduced from Mathematica, as far as I know, in the 80s. And they were really there as a perfect medium for to support scientific research and exploration, or even educational workflows, right? A document that can capture both code and calculations and data and visualization and all of the findings into one, and be able to execute all of that. Isn't that just wonderful? And I think it's a really wonderful medium when you want to share your research, when you want to explore, when you want to really tell a story. And Jupyter notebooks and Databricks notebooks, then as kind of evolution of that, they became a great companion for the data science workflows to be able to analyze data, to describe it with rich text and visualization, and be able to tell their data story. But what has happened is that in recent years, we kind of moved away from, okay, this just be an exploration tool or research tool, and now saying a lot of vendors kind of encouraging to actually use the same tool, put it in production, and use that to support your business, right? To serve your customers, to essentially those notebooks become part of your production solution. And this is the part that we are kind of putting on hold, right? The productionization, not so much usage of the notebooks. And, this was initially advertised by Netflix. They had done a fair bit of work, and it comes from a good intention, right? It is the intention of let's democratize kind of ability of programming within the data science kind of community. Databricks is advertising that as part of their kind of CI/CD or continuous delivery of the solutions that you build on their platform. And it's a case of really good intentions and poor implementation, because when you run code in production, there is an assumption that this code is going to be long-lived. It's going to be maintainable. It's going to handle errors perfectly. It has a good level of modularity, so that, if somebody else comes across your code, they can understand it, they can change it. It's extensible. There is a set of attributes that are needed to run code in production as long-lived maintainable code, and we don't think notebooks are the right mediums for that, the right vehicle for that. And then the question is, so what shall we do? How do we democratize programming? And I believe Mike's podcast that you might be referring to is gonna hopefully touch on this. So if you're interested in a solution for this, definitely tune into that podcast. So no pressure, Mike. And I think the one thing that should happen is that over time we have found ourselves with these new threads that are happening in our industry, like the data engineering or data science. We have found ourselves in this divergence of tooling that, generalist engineers use these set of tools that are perfectly tuned for them. And then these data scientists use this other set of tools. And we need to have a convergence of these tooling of these two departed world, and that convergence can come from using one stream, like one workflow, like the CD for ML, which is already on the radar, to kind of looking at these processes as one continuous flow, and then thinking very cleverly about how do we abstract complexity that a generalist programmer needs to deal with, that data scientists may not need to deal with, into ML platform kind of capabilities, anything from kind of automatic code generation or other capabilities that really abstract away those deep engineering maybe knowledge that data scientists is expected to know. So there is organizational with CDM for ML concerns, people working closely, there's an abstraction of complexity and coming up with new abstractions rather than misusing something that was designed for a very different purpose in a new context, and really stepping back and rethinking our tooling for this new world.
Thank you, Zhamak. Okay, and then we've got one theme to finish up with, and then we'll do a few questions and round up. So Cassie, we've been hinting at this one already, right?
So we have, and I'm wary of time, so I probably won't spend too much time on it since there is a podcast around this. So that's a little teaser to go into this. But one of the themes that we do want to reveal is around democratizing programming. So some of the discussions around the productionization notebooks that we're putting on hold that Zhamak just talked about, and even the low-code platforms that I was just talking about earlier. Wanted to actually talk through the theme because since I mentioned this was a very big topic of conversation. And so one of the things I wanted to do is I was kind of looking at the questions. Yes, Mike, I did find that tab finally. And there were some questions of like, oh, are we going to lose the proposition with the business, and if we actually try promoting some of these low code products and things like that. So wanted to clarify is that we're not promoting low code products, we're actually just looking at the landscape, and that's why the word bounded is on there, because we want to describe the fact that yes, we're not going to replace everything with low code products or anything like that. What we want to do is really talk about how the landscape has grown so much, and so there are some instances where low-code platforms would work out, and a lot of the things that we've seen is really some of these internal processes that may not be as customer-facing, that may not have to have this evolutionary aspect as you're trying to deal with the market and things like that. So one of the things that we wanted to talk about is really looking at your development teams, your engineering talent. And I know, like we always talk about, there's a war for engineering talent out there because there's so much to do. So what happens if we pragmatically look at what are the things that we can utilize our really strong engineering teams for some of those really big customer facing and differentiated features and outcomes for your organization. And then maybe even some of the internal, and when I talked about some of the criteria for some of the internal processes that may be more simple, and you don't need an overhead of a massive engineering team and going and deploying this to production to accomplish what you need to do from a business processes point of view or from a workflow point of view. And those are the types of things that you as an organization need to really look at and be very intentional about, as opposed to just saying, oh, let's go low code and let's do this all the way. So really looking at the different things there. I think there's definitely trade-offs, like good and bad, that will be talked about as well. But a good example of something that, when we even put the tech radar together a few weeks ago, we did it through a Google Sheet, right? We didn't have a very fancy program to actually put this thing together as we're trying to collaborate, because really thinking about the outcome of what you're trying to drive to, whether in that particular instance or what your business outcome or what your internal, customer outcome looks like. It's about being pragmatic, about seeing what you need to do. So this is a very interesting topic, and that's why we made it a theme. So yeah, more to come. That's a good segue into the podcast tomorrow.
Well, and I think that there's a couple of questions here. People are very interested in this topic. Clearly, we had a lot of questions. I answered a few just via text. But there's this kind of question, should we accept the low code proposition? And I think we have to be realistic about what's happening, which is that low code platforms have a ton of marketing and momentum behind them, and IT departments, have been disappointing businesses for years in what we deliver. Partly because it's so hard to deliver software, and people change their minds all the time, all the usual excuses we would make, but also because there's so much software to be written. And so the low code proposition of being able to have more people create software certainly resonates with the people who need software. So I think we have to at least kind of understand as technologists that this thing could be a tool in our toolbox, and we could use it at certain times, when it's appropriate for those particular problem sets. I think we would all probably agree very firmly that, there is always going to be a really strong case for custom code and strong programmers and good development teams, because that's really the way that differentiated world-class software gets built. So a few other questions. We are really running out of time, though. The full radar is coming out next week. So do look for that. Apparently we're not supposed to commit to a time frame, but I know it's coming out next week because I've seen the PDFs and the translations and stuff. We had a question early on from Abonete, who said, why does Thoughtworks take the time and effort to share the radar? Wouldn't it lower your business prospects by empowering the competition? Which is a great question. Part of the Thoughtworks mission is to drive the IT industry forwards. And we take that seriously through the work that we do, the conferences we participate in, open source that we create, books that we write, and things like this, where we try to give a bit of advice and try to help everybody do a better job with technology. So, and frankly, there's a great marketing thing as well. We've got, a ton of participants on today who are all hearing about the radar, and that's good for us as well. Question for the panelists here. Apart from, and this is from Sodi, so apart from remote native processes, what's been the most prevalent or trending developer tech that you've seen during the pandemic? And I've got an idea. I was thinking cloud-based development environments seem to have been on the up. I don't know what you guys think.
I think we had a few conversations, remember, during the radar. I think it's related to remote working, but there is a kind of, again, Cambrian explosion of all of these tools for task management, for brainstorming, for, we had Mural and a bunch of other things. So it's probably in the vicinity of the remote working tool set, but we definitely see more rapid feature development for the existing tools and the new tools coming on in terms of managing your brainstorming sessions and inception sessions and so on, and managing your workload in a distributed fashion.
Great. Super quick, any insights to share about remotely building a tech radar? I think we did a podcast on that last time, so do go look for that. Somebody asked about the podcast. I believe it's called the Thoughtworks Technology Podcast, and you should be able to search for that in whichever podcast app you have. Please give us a star rating in whatever app you use. That helps other people to find us. So I'm going to wrap up. Thank you very much to Zhamak and Cassie for being our experts today. And I'd also like to thank very much Gareth and Shani, who are our production team, who you don't see on the webinar, but they help to make sure everything runs smoothly. So please check out the ThoughtWorks Technology Radar next week when it goes live, and thank you for watching today.